Welcome to Functional Philosophy, the show in which I, Charles II, explain and apply Ayn Rand's philosophy, Objectivism. If you'd like to ask me a question on Objectivism or its application, just go to charles2.com/contact. And my last name is spelled T as in Tango, E as in Echo, and W as in Whiskey. Are altruism and nihilism compatible with each other? Well, yes, they are compatible, but they are not the same thing. One is not a subsidiary of the other. Since the end of altruism is destruction, it can facilitate nihilism, and many nihilists do use it that way. But it is possible to be a straightforward nihilist without any altruistic argument whatsoever. Environmentalists are a good example of both of the things I just talked about. Sometimes they will use altruistic arguments, even though their goal is the destruction of man as an end in itself. They'll say, what about third world countries you're destroying with global warming? What about poor people? Whatever. So they'll definitely use altruistic arguments. But then there are also environmentalists who are more straightforward, and they just say we have to destroy man in order to protect animals or even inanimate matter, nature, arranged in a configuration that bears no sign of intelligence. Really, they are the ultimate anti-intelligent designers. Not in the sense that they are strong atheists, but in the sense that they hate real intelligent design, that of human beings. Nature as it is, without the corrupting touch of intelligence, is the ultimate standard for them. Now, on the other hand, not all altruists are nihilists. Many of them, maybe even most of them, aren't. You see this all the time. There are all kinds of portrayals of heroism, of characters of moral stature that are clearly not forms of crypto-nihilism. They really are exalted and reverent, but nonetheless, in fact, ultimately destructive. But that doesn't mean that's their goal. Now, what is nihilism? Well, everyone faces, in a million different ways every day, the question of whether he is going to conform to his factual context or whether he is going to ignore it. The former is virtue, the latter is vice. If your friends come around and they want to go out drinking, and you're not sure if you have enough money to go out, but you refuse to look at your bank account and you go out anyway, that is evasion. That is immorality. But it is not nihilism. Because the goal here is a positive one. You want to go out and have a good time with your friends. And you're ignoring reality in order to try to do that. It's immoral, it's impractical, but it's not nihilism. Evasion becomes nihilism when it becomes a means of waging war against reality, not merely of ignoring it so that you can have your cake and eat it too, or so that you can believe you can have your cake and eat it too. Ignoring the fact that not going on a diet and eating a bunch of donuts will make me fat is immoral. That's not nihilism. It becomes nihilism when I ignore that the negative consequences are negative. When I try to tear down facts as an end in itself. When I start saying, well, I can be healthy at any size. Being fat is sexy. It's just as attractive as anything else. These are just your patriarchal standards. That is nihilism. That is the attempt to destroy existence as an end in itself, no longer because you want to be able to eat donuts without getting fat, but now because you hate the fact that being fat is bad, that it is what it is. You hate the fact, and that is your motivator now. Not the attempt to get some other value. It's just the hatred of existence. That is nihilism. Immorality is ignoring reality. Nihilism is hating reality. So you become a nihilist when you go from ignoring reality in order to pursue some positive value to ignoring reality as a way of trying to destroy facts, because facts don't let you do whatever you feel like while having whatever consequences you feel like. They make emotionalism impractical. Emotionalism and evasion are the same thing looked at from different perspectives. Anyway, the questioner goes on. Egoists believe that one's own life is the standard and one's own happiness is the goal. Well, interjecting here, objectivists believe that. I wouldn't say that that's essential to any kind of egoism, or to every kind of egoism. Back to the question, altruists believe that other people or something other than their own life is the standard of value, but what is the goal? This is the best example of rationalism I have ever seen. This is perfect. You are taking a pattern from one kind of thing and then trying to apply it to another kind of thing from the top down. You're not looking at the thing and getting the pattern from the ground up. You just take this pattern from this thing and say, oh, this other thing is similar in some way to this first thing, so let me apply this pattern. Egoism has a standard and a purpose. You say goal, but really it's purpose, not goal. So egoism breaks down into standard versus purpose. So why doesn't altruism break down in the same way? Now, I've excerpted this question, but so maybe this doesn't come across, but it's clear that this questioner is straining to figure it out on the premise that it must match this pattern. There must be a symmetry of pattern here. But what you're doing is the equivalent of you're looking at tools and you see a hammer and you say, okay, a hammer. I use a hammer to hammer in nails in order to create things. Okay, so there's the hammer, and then there's the thing that I put into what I'm creating. Okay, well, how does that pattern apply to a saw? Okay, a saw, I'm cutting things, so the saw is like the hammer, but what's the equivalent of the nail? There must be some equivalent of the nail. What am I putting into the wood when I'm sawing it? Maybe there are little particles that come off the sharp edges of the saw. You see, you're just straining to get this pattern to match, but there is no equivalence. It's not the same kind of thing. And what you're doing here is just as silly as the tool example I just used. Now, there is a reason that you can't find the purpose of altruism, and that's because it doesn't have one. Because altruism is an intrinsicist theory of ethics. Egoism is objective, and objective means a relationship between consciousness and existence, or a valuer and values. So you have the value, that is life, that is the standard, and then the reward to the valuer, which is happiness. Now, the whole point of altruism is that you do it just because. There is no purpose. Sacrifice for other people, that's the standard. Now, why? Well, egoists say, be selfish because it makes you happy. Do what's good for your own life because it makes you happy. Altruists say, do things that are good for other people or bad for you because God said so, just because it's self-evident that that's what morality is, even if you're not religious, which is how most people treat it. There is no purpose, and that's the point. It is good intrinsically. It is good apart from how it relates to you. That is how intrinsicist ethics function. And that is why you can find no purpose. That is a feature, not a bug. from their perspective. That is what makes it, quote, objective. Although what they really mean by that is intrinsic. This is why religious people say, oh, we have an objective standard. God is our objective standard. What they really mean is intrinsic. Here's something that's good regardless of how it relates to you. It's not subjective, doesn't depend on how it relates to your feelings or consciousness, doesn't matter if it makes you happy. It's just good. Sacrifice is just good because. Because what? No what. Just because. This is why, by the way, the conservative idea that they can be altruists for capitalism is BS. They say, oh yes, we believe in self-sacrifice, but we think it should be voluntary through charity. And so we can be total advocates for capitalism because even though we believe in self-sacrifice, we think it should be voluntary. And that's important. Well, yes, the fact that something is voluntary is very important to its status as a moral act, but the thing is, religious conservatives are intrinsicists. They think it's good just because. It's good to sacrifice because God said so, not because it has any objective relationship to you. It's good intrinsically, as an end in itself. So logically, they don't care whether you consent or go along with it. God wants this, the end. Who cares if you agree? And so they will and have historically thrown out this concern for your consent very quickly because it contradicts the basis of the morality. The basis of their ethical code is this is good regardless of how you feel about it. And that is not consistent with a concern for your consent. So they can talk all day long about how they think that charity is good, but it has to be done voluntarily. But that's going to go out the window because they don't believe that your consent is important. They believe that sacrifice for other people is good in itself, regardless of how you feel about it. It is only on an objective theory of ethics that the relationship of your consciousness to what's going on matters. But altruists are not objective. They are intrinsic. So anyway, there is no purpose to altruism. That's the whole point of an intrinsicist code of values. There is a standard without any purpose. Because if there were a purpose, well, then it would be related to your consciousness. That's what a purpose is. And therefore subjective. So their view of, quote, objectivity is to get rid of consciousness altogether. It's good to sacrifice just because it's good, regardless of how you feel about it. And that is why it's objective, according to them. So that is why you can't find the symmetry here. Next question. Why should I turn away government money by not collecting welfare? Wouldn't taking it benefit me? The destructive act of rights violation lies in the taxation, after all, not the later distribution. Well, I took this question purely for that last part because it is 100% wrong. The destructive act of rights violation does not lie solely in the taxation itself. A major component of it is the later distribution. And just think about all of the people who are worse off because they get free money from the government. Think about how welfare makes people's lives worse. Well, receiving welfare is the later distribution. That's not the act of taxation. The distribution is such a major part of the destructiveness of the government. In the United States, I think that all levels of government combined expropriate 35% of our wealth, over a third of all wealth, I think. Now, truly, we would be better off if the government simply burned all of the money it took from us. If it simply destroyed all of that wealth. It just took it and destroyed it. If it simply made us 35% less wealthy, we would be better off than if it took that 35% of our wealth and then used it to fuel further intervention into our lives. So no, the destructive act of rights violation is not just in the taxation. In fact, the later distribution is even worse than the initial taxation. We would be better off if it just took our money and burned it, if it just made us poorer. Next, your view of gun rights was something along the lines of, if the product's only purpose is to cause massive casualties and using it in a self-defense situation would result in large amounts of collateral damage, then it should be outlawed. Please correct me if I'm misattributing this sentence to you/Rand. Well, you are misattributing it. That is not what I said. Yes, I said if a product's only purpose is to cause, well, any kind of casualties, not just massive casualties, then it should be outlawed. But you determine what its purpose is by looking at the context. If you can create a weapon that is adequate for self-defense, and then you create a weapon that is more powerful than that, then to the extent that it is more powerful, its purpose is not self-defense. So you have to look in context. Now, it's not massive casualties or collateral damage per se. It's not, oh, well, this will cause collateral damage, so it should be outlawed. No. The point is, are those necessary? To the extent they're not necessary, then those casualties are actually its purpose. They're not collateral. They're the purpose of the extra power of the gun. So if, for whatever reason, you could only create fully automatic rifles, well, then I'd be okay with that. It's not the fact that they may result in extra destruction per se. It's the fact that we are capable of creating things less powerful, but totally adequate to self-defense. So in that context, creating something more powerful is illegitimate. But it's not, oh, this would kill innocent people per se, or there's a danger of that. It's that there's no need to make it that way, given that it's possible to make something weaker but adequate for self-defense. Now, this is theory. If you want to tell me that fully automatic rifle is necessary for self-defense situations, that's a totally separate argument. Just talking about in theory, whatever the line is, my point is not, well, if something causes collateral damage, it should be outlawed. No. The point is, to the extent that it's more powerful than it needs to be for self-defense, then its purpose is not self-defense, and it is those casualties. Okay, continuing on. Questioner says, my issue with this notion is that, take for example, dynamite. It has a purpose outside of mass casualties related to production and efficiency. Yes, and it should be legal. Now, dynamite is highly destructive, so I think it is legitimate for the government to gate access to such highly destructive material. I don't think a normal person should be able to go and buy 20 tons of dynamite, but a mining company should be able to, and it's really as simple as that. Now, you could get more fanciful with this. You could say in the future we have crazy mining lasers that can destroy entire planets. Should those be legal? What about industrial tools that can double as weapons of mass destruction? You remember in Star Trek 2009, the bad guy comes back to the future and his ship is just a mining ship. But it's so futuristic that even though it's not a ship of war, he can take on Kirk and all the good guys with this industrial ship. I always really liked that aspect. I thought that was really cool and interesting. But let's say something like that. Okay, you have this industrial tool that can be used as a weapon of mass destruction. Well, in that case, I would say that the government would have to control the use of that equipment to make sure that you are not going around and destroying planets. Now, you refer to later in your question using nuclear weapons to mine. Well, should a company be able to have an arsenal of nuclear missiles? I don't think so. I think it should be able to use them to mine, but the government should oversee that. Now, I think these restrictions would naturally lessen over time, because in a rational society, technology would be increasing and self-defense technology would be increasing, because we wouldn't be the cowardly appeasers we are now who consider the development of missile defense technology an act of aggression against Russia. So in a rational society, there'd be all kinds of self-defense technologies. You would have some science fiction force field or something, and then maybe the mining laser wouldn't be a threat, and you wouldn't have to have any kind of check for companies who have mining lasers, because we'd be able to defend against them. But now the questioner goes on, it's fairly easy to claim multiple purposes for any weapon. You could mine the moon with a nuke, or to bring it back to Earth, you could use an automatic weapon as a crude long-distance hole punch. Well, this goes back to the problem I had with the first part of your question. You clearly have a tendency to drop context. You are not an integrated thinker, and you should fix that. If someone came into a government office seeking permission to get a machine gun, and the government asked why this was necessary for this person's business, and the person said, well, I'm going to use it as a long-distance hole punch, it would be 100% objective for the government to say, no, you cannot get a machine gun then. That is demonstrably unnecessary. Hole punches exist. Machine guns are neither cheaper nor more efficient or effective or practical in any way. So no, you don't need a machine gun for this purpose. Your extreme out-of-context view is, I could go in and say, I want a machine gun. Oh, I'm going to use it as a hammer. I'm going to use the part of the machine gun to hammer in nails. Technically, I can use it for that. So that's my productive, non-offensive purpose for this weapon. No, because you have to judge in context. In a world in which hammers exist, in that context, you cannot justify getting a machine gun to use as a hammer. Now, if you went to dynamite, there would be no problem. It is demonstrably cheaper and more effective to use dynamite to blow up a mountain than to hire an army of people to dig it out with shovels. You know, the government has to be objective. It doesn't have to be filled with idiots. You can't just say, well, somebody could make up an excuse, so we can't have the government passing judgment on this kind of thing. No. I mean, by that standard, we can't make murder illegal. Because I could say, well, look, I have my imaginary friend. He's from another dimension. He's an invisible alien. And when you drove into my driveway, you murdered him, so you have to go to jail. And then what? Are going to say, well, we can't make murder illegal because somebody could say something crazy like that? That's ridiculous. No, you can't say I'm going to use a machine gun as a crude long-distance hole punch. That is not an argument against the standard of having a productive purpose when we're talking about the legitimacy of owning certain destructive items. Your premise seems to be that we can't have any rule that requires the government to make judgments. Well, I have bad news for you. The government is made up of people, and it is going to have to make judgments. That's why it's important for our laws to be as clear and objective as possible. But there is no way to avoid judgment by the government, and sometimes on tricky cases, although the example you gave here is not tricky at all. So, in summary, yes, products that destroy with no self-defense or productive purpose should be illegal, and what products serve a productive purpose will have to be judged by the government. But that is a legitimate function of the government, and there is no reason that it can't be done objectively and rationally. I mean, the government's going to be judging whether somebody's guilty of murder. So you can't have your standard be well, we can't have the government judging anything. Your standard should be, let's have the government only judge in matters where physical force is relevant and according to strictly objective standards. If you'd like to keep up with everything I do, just go to charles2.com. If you'd like to enable me to do more, just go to patreon.com/charles2 and become a supporter. Thanks for listening.